Right, hello and welcome to Lanterna Education's very first History Higher Level and Standard Level YouTube tutorial series. My name is Ivan. I'll be your tutor for this tutorial series. I've been with Lanterna for a couple of months now. I've really enjoyed my job. I scored 43 points in the IB and a 7 in history, so I'm going to be teaching you guys history today. I'm super excited to bring this to you guys. We have many other guides for other subjects like biology, psychology, and all sorts of other subjects, but history is one which we don't have any guides for yet. Today, however, we are uploading our first one. So it's very exciting to bring this to you guys. Now, let's talk about what we're going to do. So we're going to have a 3-part tutorial series where we're going to cover paper 1, paper 2, and paper 3. The first 2 parts will cover paper 1, which is a bit lengthier, and the third one will cover paper 2 and paper 3, which are combined and sort of both have to do with essay writing. So it really makes sense to cover them together. So yeah, I'm really excited to bring this to you guys, and essentially, without further ado, we're going to get started. So the very first thing I'm going to tell you is that this guide is going to be a guide how to get a level 7. So I'm going to present you tips and tricks from my personal experiences, from other tutors' experiences on how to score a 7 on this paper. And so after watching this guide, you're going to be armed with everything you might need to actually score a 7, given that you apply it correctly. Now, if you want to check out more resources, you can go on our website, lanternaeducation.com, for even more resources and also online private tuition in history. But we'll talk about that more later. For now, let's focus on the actual tutorial. Cool, so the first one we're going to look at is the fundamentals. So what is paper 1 and how is it different from paper 2 and paper 3? Now, paper 1, as you may be aware, is essentially a source analysis exam. So this exam, or this paper, actually grades your skills of analyzing sources. How well can you understand sources, comprehend them, and then put your own sort of answers to questions that may be posed from those sources. So the first things that you're going to have to do in order to score high is basically things like understanding the sources, understanding the question types, right? So knowing what kind of questions there are, how to answer each question type, understanding what each question actually expects you to also do. What are they looking for, you know? Because one of the things I always tell my students is that in these papers, the thing that you're actually being graded on is how well you can write that particular paper. How well can you please the examiner, right? Because at the end of the day, examiners are humans just like all of us. They have long days, they grade hundreds of papers a day. So it's very important to be able to write your answers clearly so they can follow them and have an easy time doing so. This will make it more likely for you to score high. It's just an insider trick that I always like to tell my students. So that's one thing. Now, you also need to know how to structure your answers, which has to do with clarity as well. And so these are all the things we're going to cover basically. And yeah, let's get right into it. So cool. So the first thing is question type number 1. So question type number 1 is worth 5 marks. Now, this question is going to be worth 5 marks and consist of 2 different parts. So a part A and a part B. Now, part 1 will always be worth 3 points and ask you to identify 3 things from one source. So it may ask you to identify 3 conclusions or 3 statements or arguments that you can sort of identify from a particular source. Part 2 will be worth 2 points and will be identical. So instead of asking you to identify something in source A, which is what part 1 may do, it's going to ask you to identify something in source B, which is what part 2 will do. So they're the same thing, same type of question, same type of answer that you want to write, is just different sources basically. Now in both parts, each point that you make is going to be worth 1 mark. So what that means is that in order to score full marks in this question, you have to make 5 fully valid arguments. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. Cool, so the breakdown, right? So what is this question? How do you answer it step by step? Well, there's 3 steps in my opinion, which are sort of the best and most solid ways to answer this question. The first one is to understand what you need to identify, right? So what is the question asking you to look for? Because oftentimes the sources, as you will see later, they're going to have a lot of information, right? I mean, sometimes it can get confusing. In your head, you might jumble things up and not really know what to focus on. So you have to identify what you're going to talk about. The second thing is to actually find those points once you've understood the question. And the third thing is to represent them or express them somehow in an answer which is coherent and organized, so it's easy for the examiner to grade you. So let's take a look at how to do that in practice. So we're going to be using an example from prescribed subject number 3, the move to global war. This is from the May 2019 paper. It's the one that I wrote in my exams. So I'm quite familiar with it. Now, the thing that you're going to be asked to do here is something along these lines. What, according to source I, so this is source I on the right as you can see, or this isn't necessarily source I, but source I is one of the sources in the paper you may be asked to have, were the conclusions reported to the British government regarding the March 1935 meeting in Berlin. And it's worth 3 marks like I told you earlier. Section B of question 1 is, what does source J suggest about Anglo-German relations in 1935? And it's worth 2 marks. So as you can see, they're the same kind of question. They're quite simple and straightforward. They're just for different sources. So what I'm going to do now is essentially just show you how to actually apply this in practice. So we're going to look at this source over here, which is source J. So this has to do with part number 2, and we're simply using this to save some time in this video. However, this is the same tact that you can apply to analyzing source I for part A. It doesn't really matter, but let's take a look at how we can answer this. So here we see a picture, or a photo, or a drawing rather, a sketch of Hitler and a British politician sitting down, presumably having a beer or having some coffee, and Hitler looks very happy. So the question asks, what does source J suggest about Anglo-German relations in 1935? Well, how do we answer this? Well, we have to identify those points. And some of the points that I can identify from this picture is that relations seem to be friendly, right? We can see that because Hitler is standing up, he's happy, the British politician is also smiling. So clearly at this stage in history, their relationships, or their relations, were friendly at the very least. The second point that I think you can add here is that Hitler is enthusiastic, right? Because not only are they friendly, but Hitler himself is standing up and dancing and holding a beer in his hand. And he seems very enthusiastic. So that's definitely another point you can add here. The way that you answer this in a coherent way is by saying one suggestion which source J gives regarding Anglo-German relations in 1935 is that, and then you plug in your point. So in this case, my point is that Anglo-German relations seem to be friendly. And here you can write anything else. So as you can see, the second suggestion that I write here is that Hitler is enthusiastic. So I've written this in bullet points. It's very easy and simple to follow, and this is exactly what the examiner wants from you. You want to make this easy to understand and write it in bullet point format. Right. So the next part is the summary. So what is the summary? What are my recommendations for this question, right? How do you guys actually want to answer this? This is what we're going to look at. So you want to answer with bullet points, as I just showed you. This is because here you're not being graded on your fancy language or how good you are at writing. You're being graded on your reading comprehension skills. Save the fancy writing and the elaborate language for question number 4, which is an actual essay. So keep it simple. Right, so elaborate language is not necessary. Use bullet points and spend no more than 5 minutes. And this is really a point I try to push with all my students, because this is a question which is worth 5 marks. 1 minute per mark should be very easily achievable for this question, especially when you factor in the reading time that you get on the exam. I recommend using the reading time to actually read the source and already think of your points before you answer this question, so that when the exam starts, you can answer it in maybe 2 or 3 minutes. So as a whole, this is the star question, and it's simpler than all the others, as you're going to see later. So yeah, that's question number 1. Cool, let's move on to question number 2. Right, so question number 2 is worth 4 marks, so 1 mark less than question number 1. So what's the difference here? Well, the difference is that here we're going to talk about the values and limitations of a source. So we're going to talk about the good and the bad aspects of a particular source in reference to its origin, purpose, and content. So what does this mean? Let's define some terms here. Right, so values is what makes the source good. So what makes it a reliable, a useful, a good source as a whole, right? Why is the source useful to us? The limitations are what makes a source bad, right? What makes it where does it lack? What makes it unuseful? What makes it hard to use? Why would we not want to use it? What are the limitations of that source, basically? The origin is a lot to do with the fact that each source comes from different locations, different time frames in history, different perspectives. So where does it originate from? Was it written in the 1900s? Was it written in the 1800s? When was it written? The purpose has to do with the purpose of the source. And so the purpose of the source is really probably the most complicated part here. This is a skill which you sort of learn as you practice paper ones, and it has to do with your ability to actually read the source and sort of try to see an implied purpose. So is the author trying to convince you of something? Are they trying to persuade you, inform you of something, or something else, right? So what is their purpose? Why have they actually written this source, right? Why have they gone through the trouble of doing this? Lastly, content. And content is the most straightforward one. So this simply has to do with the fact of the information in the source, right? So what is the information? What are we getting from the source? And what is it all about, basically? So now that we have these key definitions, let's look at an example. So for this source, or for this question type rather, what you want to do here is basically have free values and free limitations for the source. So even though it's worth 4 marks, you have to have a value and limitation for the origin, purpose, and content. So 2 times 6, 2 times 3 equals 6, right? So as a whole, here we have 6 points. And I recommend having one paragraph where you have all 3 values and a second paragraph where you have all 3 limitations. So the good and the bad, basically. So let's look at a worked example. How can we apply this in practice? Well, we're going to take a look at example question number 2 from the same paper that I looked at earlier with you, May 2019, prescribed subject, move to global war. So the second question here is the following. With reference to its origin, purpose, and content, analyze the value and limitations of source I for an historian studying the international response to German aggression, and it's worth 4 marks. So, what do we need to do here? Well, we need to analyze the source and look for values and limitations for a historian studying international response to German aggression. And this is important here because we're not just looking for values and limitations for anyone, we're looking at values and limitations for a historian. So what may be important and not important for a historian, right? We're not talking about a school teacher. We're not talking about an everyday person. We're talking about a historian. So when you look at this question and analyze the text later, you have to sort of think of that as you're analyzing. And remember that you're talking about a historian who's interested in the international response to German aggression, nothing else. Right, so how can we do this in practice? So essentially, this is what it looks like. So let's take a look at the analysis here. So I'm just going to bring everything up on the slide real quick. Now at the very top, we have the question, and then we have the actual source. So what I've done is I've highlighted here green, blue, and yellow. Now the green refers to the origin. So let's talk about the origin. So what are some possible values, and what are some possible values of this source basically that we can extract from it? And feel free to pause this slide and sort of just take a longer look at it, read the source if you need to. But for now, let's take a look at the origin. So the origin is that it comes from the British cabinet. So there are notes for the British cabinet from the meeting between Hitler and John Simon, which is a British politician. So the value there is the fact that it's an official record of the meeting, right? It's a government-issued record, so it's very reliable. So that's a value of the origin. The fact that it's a government-issued paper or document is very useful for us because it's reliable. A limitation for the source, however, can also be the fact that since it's published in 1935 March, this means that the only thing that we're getting here in terms of response to German aggression is until the year 1935. And if you study European history, you know that after 1935, Germany continues to be aggressive and actually eventually starts World War II. So a limitation here is that because the source was published in 1935, it only talks about international response to German aggression before 1935 or up to. So nothing past that. So that's a limitation, right? Because it doesn't tell us what happened afterwards. In terms of the content, the blue section, the reason that the content here is a value is because it offers first-hand information. So the first-hand experience of those politicians. And this is usually something we can't get access to, for example, in a newspaper or an online article. Back then, anyway, we're talking about newspapers, of course. So it's very valuable to us because it's first-hand experience and information which we can't gain anywhere else. So that's why it's good content. A limitation of the content is, however, that it also is only focused on Anglo-German relations. So here we only talk about the British response, more or less, to German aggression, not French response, not international response, nothing else. So that's a limitation. Finally, we have the purpose. So a value for the purpose is that this source reveals that the British government was disappointed, right? So you can see that in the yellow section here. What it writes is that what he regretted was that they had not been able to do more in the direction of promoting the general agreement. This means that the British politician was disappointed, and that's not good. That means that the meeting wasn't very fruitful, wasn't very productive, I guess. And so that's a limitation here, and this is why. The fact that it says that they were disappointed implies that this sort of source may be slightly biased. And the reason for that is because since it's biased, it may be sort of inclined to portray Britain as the good guys and Germany as sort of the bad guys in terms of the fact that Britain was trying to reconcile with them and reach an agreement and Germany just didn't want that. So that's a limitation. In terms of a value for the purpose, it reveals that they were disappointed about the limited progress of negotiations. And so in this case, we can argue that the purpose is to inform. So it's simply trying to inform us that it's, that the meeting was disappointing. But on the flip on the flip side of that coin, we have the other aspect, the other perspective, where we can argue that the purpose is also a limitation, simply because it may be biased to sort of portray Germany as the bad guys and Britain as the good guys who tried to fix things but were simply unable to. So that's how I would analyze this, and feel free to take a look at this and read everything in detail, but that's my analysis of this. So yeah, now the summary of this question is basically have 2 paragraphs, okay? Have 1 paragraph with 3 limitations and have a 1 paragraph with 3 values and 1 paragraph with 3 limitations. The order there doesn't really matter, just make sure that the limitations and values are sort of in separate paragraphs. Have them in triplets, basically. Also, don't spend more than 15 minutes on this question. It really shouldn't take you much longer than that. And if it does, I recommend moving to the next question type because it's going to be worth more points and your chances of scoring there are going to be higher. So have only free values and free limitations. Don't have more. You don't need more. You're not going to get points if you write 10, right? You're just going to waste your time and it's going to hurt you elsewhere. And don't write less either, because then you will not be able to score 4 points. You'll score maybe 3 or 2 points. So not recommended to write more or less, basically. And have balance. What this means is, once again, half free and half free of each, right? Don't have 2 limitations and 2 values. That will, even though it adds up to 5 points, it will most likely get you a free and not 4 points, simply because the ideas aren't balanced. You need an equal number of each, basically. Right, so that concludes our very first video. What we're going to cover in the second video is essentially part 2 of paper 1, where we're going to cover question type number 3 and question type number 4, which are a lot more lengthier and sort of have more content in them. So stay tuned for that. For now, feel welcome to sort of check out lanternaeducation.com for online private tuition. I'd be more than happy to be your tutor in history, sort of show you how to apply all these tactics. I mean, I've been through the process and all our tutors have been through the process, so it's great stuff. I mean, we understand how you guys feel and we really want to make you the best students possible. So yeah, well, feel free to check out our online resources and private tuition. And that's all from me, so I'll see you for the next video.